Uh, Real light reading for us this morning, right? When Justin asked me to preach, he gave me the option to preach on like John 3:16, and I was like, no, I want the most complicated, convoluted Roman text, and if you could throw some circumcision in there, then that'd be a real home run for me. Yeah, we're gonna unpack this today, but let me tell you, I hope you drink your espresso, your matcha, your green tea, whatever you need to get that brain turned on. That would be really great. For those of you that don't know me, I am not Justin, even though I look like the slightly less attractive, shorter, but slightly more fashionable younger brother. We're not related. Although this first couple months here, people were getting us confused. And they're like, were you that guy? No, I'm not that guy. My name is Chad Martin. I'm an elder at this church. My beautiful wife and I have been going to this church for 13 years. We came when Vince started here at the school. We have 3 awesome kids who are in the elementary school at Calvary Christian School. And I'm also on faculty at Calvary Christian School. I also have a tent up on the field behind, the school because I'm there 6 days a week during the year. I teach U.S. history. I teach Bible classes. I lead worship band class for the middle school there. So as Justin was kind of encouraging me to teach this morning, he was like, yeah, man, you teach like every day. And I'm like, yeah, the Constitution to like 8th graders, not like theological implications of circumcision to adults. Like, this is slightly a little bit out of my depth, but I'm excited about this. I learned a lot this week. I'm excited about teaching kind of what God has revealed to me, and the history guy in me was really intrigued by the cultural context and learning about this. The Bible teacher in me was like, okay, I can't wait to like tie it together and teach it to people and bring the gospel. And the guitar player in me was just tired. Was like, this is a lot of work. And so we have some incredible pastors here, Justin, Markel, Jordan. They do a phenomenal job, and it's an incredible amount of work to prepare a message. So thank you for entrusting me with this morning. I look forward to getting into this with you. We're going to be looking at the text pretty frequently because I'm assuming you did not get all of that in one go, just like that, right? So we're going to be trying to not drink from a fire hose and actually break it down. So if you haven't been with us the last several weeks, we've been studying Romans, and this is Paul's letter to the church in Rome. And just to catch you up, evidence suggests that Paul is writing this from Corinth. He was likely accompanied by, someone like named Gaius, for example. And when you read Paul's writings, we know he's like this very legal mind making these profound arguments. And he's a no-nonsense guy. And, he's right now writing these arguments to talk to the Jews and Gentiles alike about how we live in a response to the good news about Jesus. And as you read his letters, it kind of blows my mind. He will just like relentlessly hammer home these ideas just over and over again. And he'll harp on like one word and just hammer it. Like Romans 2:12-16, he was talking about the law, right? And he wrote the word law like 10 different times in those 5 verses. I just got to imagine that, he's maybe sitting there with his buddy Gaius and he's writing and he's like, man, this is good stuff. And he's like, man, I got to hit on circumcision. And Gaius is like, dude, like, okay, maybe you can write that a couple times. And Paul's like, hold my beer. You have no idea what I'm going to do. I'm about to slam this because you have no idea what's coming. And what he's about to do is unpack really 2 distinct warnings to the Jews and the Gentiles. But we're going to get into it. So we're going to do a little rewind just to get caught up on the previous passage because both of these kind of warnings really span this good chunk of this text, okay? So in chapter 2, verses 17-24, Paul is really calling out the Jews. If you remember back to what Justin said a couple weeks ago, for really dishonoring God. And this is, you got to keep in mind that Paul is writing this, and it's a little offensive, very offensive to these people because they know the law, like they're in, okay? He says things like, if you call yourself a Jew, I mean, what he means here is if you call yourself a law-abiding, devout, religiously sound person who's kind of bragging about knowing the things of God, knowing the law of God, then why do you break the law? Despite the benefits of being the recipients of God's law, in verses 17 to 20, they're not practicing what they preach. And so because of this dishonor towards God, Paul's literally saying, like, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's like a gut punch. Like that hurts. He says, just because you have the law doesn't mean that you're abiding by it. Okay? He's challenging their assumption that the mere possession of the law will spare them of God's wrath. The law doesn't guarantee them God's favor, but rather it's a roadmap or a pathway to obedience. I'll say that again. Simply knowing or possessing God's law isn't sparing us. It's just a roadmap for obedience. And so we practice this assumption like on a regular basis. Like we do this all the time. You know, even things that we can actually see physical manifestation from. So, for example, I'm a parent of a 10-year-old, and, you know, if I've heard about this addictive snack sweeping the nation among the upper elementary school, and it's called Takis. You may have heard of these before. You know, apparently they're made of a long list of ingredients that I have really an incredible difficulty pronouncing the names of. But as someone who's not a health professional, I can imagine they're not good to put in your body. Monosodium glutamate, MSG, which I think was really popular in the 80s. Tertiary butyl hydroquinone, okay, disodium guanylate, and the classic red dye number 40 are some of the main ingredients, okay? I think these serve as a warning to us that these are not something we should be ingesting on a regular basis. However, the point is not that you shouldn't eat Takis, although I don't think you should. The point is that here in the 21st century, we have all of this information that says, you know, this is unhealthy in large quantities, or you won't lead a healthier lifestyle if you ingest this. This is ultimately going to be destructive to you and not beneficial. Yet, people still choose to consume it, right? Still do it. So I'm sure you can think of many more examples of ways that we act kind of counter towards the instruction manual despite knowing it, right? This is something that's just a physical manifestation, but where it's a lot harder to conceal. How much easier is it for us to practice and live this way when we hide things in our spiritual lives? So the danger that Paul warns against here is one of overconfidence. And so remember, the Jews who know the law, they would have been hearing this and saying, oh, wow, okay, so you're saying that just because I know all these things, like I'm not necessarily living the way that I should be. So don't assume that just because you have the truth, you're living by it and following it in practice. So Paul's audience would have been, you know, these religious elites. They prided themselves on their unique standing with God because they possessed the truth. They boasted about their status as God's chosen people. They bragged about their moral superiority over the Gentiles. And Paul is leaning into this idea that saying knowing the law doesn't just guarantee you're righteous before God. So that's like warning number one. Okay? In verse 25, then Paul shifts his attention toward circumcision. Okay? And this next section is going to hit home a little harder because circumcision was the Jews' sign of their covenant with God. Okay? This was their outward sign of their covenant. So let's dig into some historical context of circumcision. I'd like to start with a few visual aids. Just kidding. Just keeping your attention, just giving your attention. So the rite of circumcision as a covenant between God and Israel can be traced all the way back to Abraham. In Genesis 17, at the time that Abram, keep in mind there's something that happens here, he was 99 years old. The Lord appears to him and says, I am God Almighty, walk blameless before me. And then he proceeds to lay out his covenant with him. He says that he'll be the father of many nations, that he even changes his name from Abram to Abraham, promises that he'll be fruitful, and then God tells Abraham that he must keep his covenant along with his descendants. He tells Abraham that all males must be circumcised on the 8th day to be a part of the covenant between God and Israel. As you can imagine, this was a very serious matter. Okay? Anyone who did not bear this sign of circumcision was considered an outsider, separated from God's chosen people. So a big deal. This act was also permanent, so the implication was that when it was done, it couldn't be undone. It was a forever thing, and it meant that you were in. You were in the family. So this is what the Jews would have understood at the time of Paul's writing. That act, that outward sign, that outward symbol would have been a source of religious security, confidence, and as Paul even alludes to, even a religious arrogance when comparing themselves to the uncircumcised Gentiles. So we heard earlier about danger number 1, right? Paul's warning about a misled or misleading religious confidence just because you know the law. He reminds the Jews that they were privileged because they were given the truth. And as circumcision becomes the topic in verse 25, he's now warning about another danger that is coupled with that first one, and that is that thinking we are righteous or right before God simply by association. The Jews believed that they had secured their salvation because they were circumcised. Even notable Rabbi Menachem, 20th century rabbi, in his commentary of the Book of Moses said that no circumcised man will see hell. They believed that the sign was their proof of salvation. However, Paul is saying in no uncertain terms that circumcision does not justify man before God. So I think of it as like a symbolic wedding ring between God and his people. It held great value for the person that was living out its intended significance. However, it was disregarded, and it was as meaningless as a wedding ring on an adulterer's finger. The faith and a life lived in obedience is what gave it its purpose. Okay, so Paul continues on, and I'll read verse 26 to 27. He says, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code in circumcision, are a lawbreaker. So it kind of adds a little fuel to the fire here, because he's saying that the uncircumcised Gentiles who do keep the law should be recognized as circumcised. He even goes one step further by saying that these Gentiles could bear witness against those who have broken the law. This would have been an incredible insult, calling another Jew an uncircumcised one. But Paul was in the business of getting people's attention and focusing their hearts where they should. So what does this mean for us? I think we need to do this exercise. I think let's substitute the word circumcision for any of these, and you might think of something else on your own. Was he there the whole time? Did I? Wow. Okay. Sorry. That just blew my mind a little bit. I did not see him walk up if he did. Okay, so let's substitute this word circumcision for any of these. Church membership, baptism, confirmation, Methodist, Presbyterian, youth group, fill in the blank. There are a lot of possible affiliations or religious rites here, but the truth is that all are outward circumcisions. It's very possible to trust Christianity more than Christ himself. Say that again. It's very possible to trust Christianity and the things of Christianity more than Christ himself. It's possible for us to fall into what is commonly called dead orthodoxy, where we follow our basic doctrines pretty strictly. We go through the motions, we look the part, but there's no real internal transformation. Okay, feel free to plug in your own analogy here. One that comes to my mind is this fascinating revolution of athleisure clothing. My wife told me about this term like not too long ago. If you're not familiar with athleisure clothing, I suggest you go to Brentwood like on a Tuesday morning, and half the people walking around are in athleisure clothing. I assumed they were just getting lattes between their spin class and their megaformer class, but their hair looks great and their makeup's still on and they look really, really fabulous for having worked out. I doubt it, right? They're looking the part. And the point is not to dog athleisure clothing. It's actually very comfortable. I like it myself. But outward conformity does not indicate inward transformation. What's on the outside does not indicate what's on the inside. This is the difference between an outside-out form of Christianity rather than a true gospel, faith, inside-out Christianity. Okay? We cannot solve an inside problem from the outside. Verse 29 makes it clear that this is a matter of the heart. If you're following along, I'm going to read 29. It says, "No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly." And again, you can substitute Jew for yourself. Okay? A man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. Okay? So, without an authentic transformation of the heart, we are easily deceived by the comfort and familiarity of our religious affiliations. If we get real with ourselves for a second and reflect on these questions, it might tug at you a little bit like it does me. Do we think that our theological correctness makes us superior to others? Do we take pride in our moral conduct? Do we rely on great emotional experiences in worship, for example? Or do we substitute strict sacraments, rituals, tradition, and deep, profound liturgy for authentic righteousness? This is what Paul is unearthing in order for us to reflect on the posture of our heart. What matters more than bearing the outward sign is living out the inward reality which the sign represents. Last fall, celebrating one of our own legends, Mr. Jim Wadsworth. I think he's here today. I think I saw him somewhere. I'm so glad he's here if he is. But Jordan, his son, and Jordan's friends got together, and they said, we're going to go celebrate him. I was fortunate enough to be in this group. And so they put together this night, and late in the evening, we found ourselves at a particular beverage establishment, which is, I think, what they're called. And it happened to be late in the game of Game 2, Dodgers-Yankees World Series. You might remember this. You may not be a baseball fan. You may not remember the game. But the Yankees were making kind of a late push in the game. They scored one run in the ninth inning, and it was getting tense. And the moment that the Dodgers got the final out, every single person in that building who was a Dodgers fan was going crazy. They were yelling, they were cheering, they were high-fiving, all of that. And did not matter what they were wearing. You could tell exactly who the Dodgers fans were, whether they were in the business suit coming off of, from work, whether they were wearing everything, Dodgers hat and jersey. It was very clear to see where their inward allegiance and affections were just by their actions. And the outward sign of the Dodgers gear was just a reflection of that inward affection. You could have put a Dodgers hat on me, and I would have been unmoved. Not because I don't like the Dodgers, but because I didn't grow up in LA and I'm not a Dodgers fan, and my allegiance is with a different team. We'll get into that later. Some of you, your hair already caught on fire because you know. But the point is that the outward sign was a reflection of what was going on in here. So as we move to chapter 3, things get really interesting because Paul, again, is this legal mind, and he's already anticipating objections and questions and counter-arguments to everything that he's just said. And so, he literally just told, the most religious group that their outward sign that shows that they're in the club is really meaningless without heart change. And over the next 8 verses, he's going to lay out his argument in response to these presumed objections, okay? So I kind of picture in my mind, Paul flips up one end of the ping pong table, and he's doing the Forrest Gump thing, playing against himself. And he's like, you got that? Okay, I'm going to send this back to you. You're going to say this, and I'm going to say that. And he just kind of has this theological ping pong match that he is going to lay out to the reader. So here we go. Chapter 3, verse 1, the first question or objection is, well, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Essentially, they're saying, well, you just told us that all the stuff that we've been doing isn't what it seems because it's something different. It doesn't matter. He goes, well, what advantage is there? Well, I'll tell you. Today's language, you would seem something like this. What is the advantage of being under the umbrella of Christianity or the church if things like baptism, membership, possession of the word are not enough to save us? And it's a fair question, especially for someone who doesn't grow up in the church. But Paul comes back immediately and says, this is a huge advantage. He's like, I'm going to tell you why. Verse 3:2 says, much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. Okay? Last week, Markel did a fantastic job of talking about God's general revelation, where things we can see, we can touch, we can smell, and calculate and derive logical understanding from, right? The world has God's general revelation. Open your eyes and see. What Paul's talking about now is special revelation. This gives us, the Bible, gives us the written description of God's eternal nature. It teaches about the life of Jesus. And so we learn about his holiness, his righteousness, his love, and justice. This special revelation gives us our purpose, and it frames who we are and who we're created to be. Okay, it gives us the requirements and promise of our salvation. And so in that one sentence, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. Like, that's what we have. That is a huge, huge advantage. So Paul's like, what do you mean? Of course. So then, next question. It says, well, if so many are unfaithful, does this nullify God's word or his promise of salvation? Paul says, of course not. That no matter how much a man falls short, God's promises of salvation remain. Okay, we even see Paul quoting David from Psalm 51:4. He says, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Further, just saying, affirming God's justice as part of his righteousness. We get another question. Well, Paul, if we're so unrighteous apart from his grace, then God would be unfair to judge us. Paul says, hold on that logic, then God would not judge anyone, which completely flies in the face of the presupposition that God would judge the world, especially those Gentiles outside the covenant. If Gentiles escape judgment, then the covenant made with Israel would mean nothing. Again, Paul's just poking holes in these objections. Final question says, well, in that case, if me sinning reveals more of God's glory and goodness, then shouldn't we start sinning all the more? Paul goes, this argument is insane. He's so off base, doesn't even distinguish the difference between good and evil. He says, their condemnation is just. He says, if you're thinking this way, their condemnation is just. He actually revisits this later in Romans 6. You guys might be more familiar with this passage where he says, shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? He says, by no means. He says, we died to sin. How can we live in sin any longer? Paul's like, you're supposed to be putting these sins to death. Why in the world would you advocate for living in something that is dead? So Paul lays out these arguments, and essentially he has kind of divided these people into two groups, and he's looking over here kind of at this one side, and he says, hey, you over here who are so hung up on your outward religiosity, your pride in your moral superiority, your comfort in your association, you need the gospel and heart change. And then he says over here, he says, hey, you over here who say, like, none of this matters because, God's grace is going to just continue to pour out and overflow if we just kind of keep living the way we do, so it's fine if we don't do this. He goes, no, you need heart change. You need the gospel. And it's both. The outward sign, the outward symbol, everything that we do is meaningful when we allow God to change our hearts, when we experience true transformation in our hearts. It means everyone needs the gospel. Jew or Gentile, all are under sin. No one is righteous. The morally upright who told a tiny little white lie, or the morally reprehensible who swindles people out of their life savings. All are lost, and there aren't different degrees of lostness. I love this analogy from Tim Keller. He says, imagine three people trying to swim from Hawaii to Japan. Says first person jumps in, first person can't swim. They're not a swimmer, they get in the water, they flounder and they sink when they're out of their depth. Second person gets in, maybe they can swim a little bit better. They start swimming for some distance and they run out of steam and they drown. Third person is a championship swimmer and they're really good at swimming. They've got all 4 strokes. They're good. And they start cruising and they swim for some distance, maybe 30, 40 miles, okay? Eventually, they are going to run out of steam and they sink and they drown. Are any of the 3 more drowned than the others? No, none of them made it to Japan and they're all drowned, right? No one made it in the same way. The morally religious and the immoral pagan are equally condemned because we have all fallen short of God's righteous standard. Let me say this too, that there are definitely different degrees of sin. We know that, okay? The Bible tells us that. But even if it's the smallest to the largest, even if you think you've got it all figured out, we are still in desperate need of Christ's saving. So where's the hope, right? If it's like, well, this side doesn't get it and this side doesn't get it, where is it? Well, I think we know the answer to this, but I want to give you this example. So back in the day, or ancient times, as one would say, you wouldn't sign your name to bind a deal, okay? Today, we sign contracts. You know, we say, my word is my bond. You know, we say things like that. But instead, back in the day, you would actually act out the curse that you would accept if you broke the deal. So for example, someone might reach down, grab up some sand and pour sand on their head and say, well, if I break this promise, may I end up like the dust. Or they might take an animal and they might cut it in half and split the 2 sides apart, walk right in the middle and say, if I break this covenant, then may I become like this animal. That's what God did with Abraham. Circumcision is the same way. A sign that if you break the covenant relationship with God, then you would be cut off. Clearly, we know that no one is righteous enough to uphold this deal, though, right? We can't do it. We can't do it on our own. So how do we get right with God? Well, it's the gospel. Paul says in Colossians, he says that we've been circumcised in Christ on the cross. In Jesus' death, he was forsaken. And as it was written in Isaiah 53:8, it says he was cut off from the land of the living. He was circumcised, cut off from the Father, bore the curse of the breaking of the covenant on behalf of both the religious and the non-religious. I was having this conversation a couple weeks ago in our discipleship group, and I know that there's a few pockets of us that are in this group together, so I think some of you will connect to this. We were discussing God's story and really looking at the 4 pillars of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And we were discussing as a group kind of these areas in which we may have felt like we were rebelling or almost missing, had a blind spot or in need of repentance in one of these areas. And I realized in that moment that I was holding on to pride over how much I thought I didn't sin. I was like, yeah, I know I need God's grace, but not as much as these people. And there was no one in particular sitting next to me. I think my wife was at the time, but she's wonderful. The point is that I did not feel the weight of my sin. Justin, who was leading the Bible study, he kind of just simply leaned over and said, oftentimes if we don't feel a heaviness enough, or we don't feel the weight of our sin enough, then we have too light of a view of the cross. We don't have a deep, significant, profound enough view of the work of the cross. Our human nature is to kind of puff ourselves up a little bit and minimize our sin, which diminishes the seriousness of the cross. So my challenge for you, my hope for you, is that, many of us have kind of grown up in the church, and we know we do these things, and we show up and we participate in things like communion, and we've been baptized, and my hope for you, my challenge for you is that we would put that in its rightful place and know that it is not about that. It's about our relationship and our continued redemption and restoration in Christ. Because without that, it doesn't really mean much. Okay? We'll find ourselves in that same seat as many of those religious elites, the Jews, that said, hey, we've got it all together. Look, we're living by the book. Inwardly, we're a wreck. And so, as we wrap up, I just want to remind you that Christ died for everyone. Whatever side that you're on, whatever side you find yourself on, you might not be someone who really goes to church that much. And you go, yeah, but God's grace is big enough for me. I hope the challenge for you is that you would spend some time in deep reflection and prayer, asking God to reveal more of himself to you, that would draw you in more from both sides.